Shalom. So, I'm here with Clown of Babylon with his clown shirt, hat, and with Sandy. And I have to admit, it's been like a year or so since I read Halakhic Man the most recent time. I read it once a while, like 20 years ago. So I was not prepared to lead a book group on it, which is why Elijah, or Clown of Babylon, is actually going to have to lead all of this. But I figured I should be here in case anybody has questions or there needs to be clarifications as far as Jewish stuff. There is a link in the chat. Everyone is welcome. And take it away, Elijah.
All right. Hello. How are you, Sandy?
I'm well, thanks.
How are you, Jacob?
I'm well, thank you.
All right. So, yes, the Halakhic Man. Maybe we should just do a brief introduction for anybody that didn't read it or is just kind of tuning in. So, I guess the kind of synopsis is that, well, what would you say that this is kind of like Rabbi Soloveitchik's like magnum opus on what it means to be a Jew?
Yeah, so it's become a very big Ben Zion. How are you?
Mr. Ben.
Hey, how's it going?
Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik is known as the Rav, just as the Rav, as in the rabbi. So, in English. So he's a very well-known figure, and Orthodox Judaism is kind of split up into two camps, which is don't use the term ultra-Orthodox, but ultra-Orthodox is what a lot of people know it as, which is the Haredi camp, which is much more insular, and what is often termed modern Orthodox. And the Rav was known as basically the main figure of modern Orthodox Judaism in the United States. He was the leader of Yeshiva University during his life, and he ordained large numbers of rabbis, and so he is a scion of the Brisk dynasty. So the Soloveitchik name has been a very important name in Judaism for hundreds of years. And when he wrote this Ha'ish HaHalacha in Hebrew, it made a big splash and was translated to English. I believe he originally wrote it in the 70s.
44.
And, excuse me?
1944 in Hebrew.
1944, wow,
Yeah,
okay.
very early.
So it was translated to English, and it's still considered basically, so he was the first real rabbi to write something which engaged with like Kierkegaard and, modern philosophy in a very serious way. And so it's still considered like this very good representation of Orthodox Judaism interacting with modern philosophy. And that's why it's become so pivotal. He spends a little bit of time in it, especially in the notes, talking about the internal differences between the Hasidic, and he was from what's called the Lithuanian, it's often called the Yeshivish crowd, Ashkenazi. And so he spends a little bit of time distinguishing with Hasidism and defending the Lithuanian tradition, but it's it's very much, I mean, basically he is representing Orthodox Judaism.
And would you say that the kind of motto of Yeshiva University, Torah Umada, is accurate to represent his views, or do you think that they're more nuanced than that?
So the term Torah Umada actually comes, it's actually a little bit older than Yeshiva University. It refers to, I believe, Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and Rabbi Hirsch was basically the founder of Orthodox Judaism, in that before Reform reared its ugly head in Germany, as you can tell, I'm not a Reform Jew. There was no such thing as Orthodox Judaism. There was just Judaism. And when Reform started as a movement in response to it, Rabbi Hirsch and the Hirsch Chumash, the Hirsch commentary on the 5 books of Moses, is still widely read today as one of the first real engagements between serious Jewish learning and serious Western learning. And and so he came up with this term Torah Umada to basically steal STEL, strengthen Orthodox Judaism in against the advance of what's called the Jewish Enlightenment and Reform Judaism. And so Yeshiva University very much goes down that same line from Rabbi Hirsch, and Rabbi Soloveitchik is definitely an heir to that same tradition from Shimshon Raphael Hirsch.
Okay, sweet. I think maybe the next thing that we can do, well, thank you for that, Jacob, by the way. Appreciate your little introduction and filling us in if we didn't know some of the history. Maybe I think a good thing to start would be just kind of like first impressions that we had with it. And then from there, we can kind of go down into specifics if we like. So I'll go first, and then maybe we'll go Sandy and then Ben, just because that's how we seem to be in the StreamYard. So I liked some of it, and I disliked other parts of it. I felt like sometimes he would say something that was like very profound, and then the next paragraph he'd say something, and I was like, I don't know, I don't know about that one, boss. You're kind of a little bit off the track, I think. And one thing that I think was interesting for me is that it feels very like modern, right? It feels like once I realized that it was written in 1944, it kind of made a lot of sense. And I think I did a little bit of a Wikipedia, and it looks like the Rav studied in Berlin. And I also read one of his earlier books, The Lonely Man of Faith. And he also does this kind of thing where The Lonely Man of Faith, he talks about like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and he uses that as like contrasted. It seems like in the Halakhic Man so far, he's doing this same kind of like dichotomy thing again. And then trying to bring maybe unity to it in the Halakhic Man. Like he's saying, oh, like there's the cognitive man, and then there's the religious man, and then the Halakhic man is like the unity of it. But I don't know if I really accept this breakdown, but I think we can discuss that a little bit later. So what about you, Sandy? What do you think?
I read through it a few times. The writing style is very different than I'm used to at the moment. It's very cool. It's very high level, so it feels more like being at university than actually just sitting down and reading a book. I also noticed that strong use of contrasts and repetition. He uses a lot of contrast and a lot of repetition to get his point across, and I don't think I really could say I enjoyed it until today, when I was finally sort of getting through to the third portion for again, and just really starting to feel the interest of the place he's getting to, where he's contrasted, I think because in a sense he was contrasting the religious with the cognitive so much. But then I had to allow myself to relax into actually hearing how they both somehow meld into, even though the contrast still exists, there's a unity in it simply in being the Halakhic man. It was a bit exhausting, but yeah, well worth the read.
Thank you. What about you, Ben?
Yeah. So, I mean, I read through, just to confirm, I read through the first 3 chapters. So, I found, I mean, yeah, so it seems like he's building the thesis at first. I found it, I mean, I enjoyed it, kind of like provoked a few thoughts. So I did enjoy that. I was kind of curious when he mentioned, he was trying to contrast, right, the cognitive man and the religious man, I would call it. I don't remember the Latin term. And he was saying something about how the religious man revels in mystery, or the riddle just gets bigger and bigger to the religious man, which is part of the fun, let's say, of being in the world. So I was curious about that, and I don't know if I got it exactly. It did become interesting when he mentioned Job, and which then reminded me of a movie like A Serious Man, and I could definitely, and so that was something that I related to, and I could definitely see how there's something there with that. Well, I don't know if it was reveling in the mystery there, but it was definitely something about you need to just be okay with the mystery. I mean, there's literally like a quote from A Serious Man, as it says, accept the mystery. So that was interesting. That was an interesting part.
Yeah. Was there any topic that you really want to like start to delve into? Ben, Sandy, anyone in particular?
Not for me, but in particular.
Yeah, I think for me, I think one thing I noticed is that it seems like he's very Hegelian in a sense in all of his thinking, where he kind of does that, the synthesis, antithesis kind of aspect of dialectics. But one thing he seems to almost accept implicitly is called the splitting of the logos. I don't know if everyone is necessarily familiar with this. I have another book. One of my the rabbis that I found interesting is Jose Faur. He's called Chacham Faur because he's a Sephardic rabbi. But if you don't mind, I'll read a little passage, and maybe that will spark some interest in kind of why I don't necessarily like this kind of framing almost. So this is from his book, The Golden Doves with Silver Dots. He says, in the West, philosophy stood in hierarchical opposition to rhetoric. This opposition further generated a whole series of hierarchical oppositions, for example, inner and outer, content, context, thought, language, speech, writing. In this sense, philosophy, as well as rhetoric, are specifically Greek. Rabbinic tradition is the only intellectual and cultural movement to have continued developing since antiquity without a primeval rupture, an inaugural split, resulting in the endless series of hierarchical oppositions. The comparison of knowledge to a tree of life, Proverbs 3:18, underlies the organic connection and interdependence of all cognitive subjects. As Maimonides puts it, everything which exists is as one single individual. That is, the whole universe is organically connected and interdependent. To the Hebrew mind, there are no autonomous, arbitrarily disconnected subjects or concepts which can be examined in pristine intellectual isolation. The philosophy-rhetoric split is already evident in the clash between Gorgias and Socrates. Constitutes a pivotal moment in the intellectual history of the West. In mythological thinking, logos means both word and idea. knowledge includes both meaning and articulation of meaning. Meaning and literature were therefore inseparable and indistinguishable from one another. The division of knowledge established by the philosophy-rhetoric opposition and subsequent victory of the former over the latter posits a new conception of meaning and language. Meaning is determined by universal categories of thought, independent of any particular language. Anyway, so it seems like on page, where does he say this?
And Elijah, do you mind repeating the reference you just read?
Yes, so that's Golden Doves with Silver Dots by Chacham Jose Faour. Good luck finding it. It's like $250 or like $400 online. So luckily, I got it on interlibrary loan. But there's also like a free PDF you can kind of find somewhere. He says something like, in chapter 3, at the beginning, he says, in truth, these two attitudes parallel the twofold nature of existence itself. The ontological dualism is a reflection of onic dualism, and onic is like real dualism. So it seems the thing that's strange to me, at least in this little statement at the beginning of section 3, is that he accepts, it seems, almost this split of the logos. And I guess what I'm trying to get about this is that it seems to me that this is like the cause of confusion. And it's strange because I'm assuming, right, that later on in this book he'll say, oh, the Halakhic man like unifies these things. But when he says, like, he's actually accepting it, but he's saying, oh, the Halakhic man like unifies it. But to me it seems like you should actually reject that. It's like he says the twofold nature of existence itself, which seems like it's asserting that there are these differences. When it would, to me, like, this is why I don't kind of understand this beginning bit, because it seems to be like just contrary. You know, I was thinking about this in terms of like, imagine like, you know, Chad's trowel, right, that he uses to like spread mortar. Like maybe that's gonna have like a meaning to him, but like the meaning can't be separate from the fact that it is a trowel. Like it can't be like, you can't find it meaningful like a pet, because it's not a pet, right? Like it's a trowel, he uses it for work. And so like with this kind of splitting of the logos, there's like a difference between like what something is and then like the meaning of something, where he kind of talks about, right, the cognitive man wants to know like what things are, and the religious man wants to know like the meaning of things. But I don't think that you can have like a split. Like it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know.
Well, I don't want to dominate the conversation too much, but note 4. So it's really, really important to actually read the notes in Halakhic Man, partially because you know, just translating from Hebrew to English loses a certain amount of what the Rav was trying to do, which is to take Western philosophy and actually engage with it well. And you're right. I mean, Hegel's note. So note 4, some 20 years ago, I typed it up and put it up on my live journal, and then I moved it to my Facebook, and then I moved it to Discord, and I have a video about it.
Oh my gosh.
Because it's really a, I think, fundamental understanding of what's wrong actually with Protestant Christianity and Reform Judaism. And he really calls it out there. So you have to understand that the Rav comes from a point of view where he accepts Jewish tradition as true. And so he's trying to understand reality and trying to understand Western philosophy from a point of view of Torah is true. And one of the 13 attributes that the Torah is understood through is is kind of like a dialectic. It's shnei pesukim shemachrishim ze et ze ad shehashlishi bav umachriya beinehem. Two verses in the Bible disagree with each other until a third comes and makes it evident, right? And part of this process of Jewish learning, right, is that it's not as if the question, the shakel and taria of the Talmud, right, the give and take of the Talmud, it's not as if you ask a question and then you give an answer and you might as well never have had the question, but rather that it's a road you are traveling through to get to some place that makes that road greater. Like, you're better off after following that road than you were before. You want to say something, Sandy?
I apologize. I've kind of I'm trying to read around the conversation. So note 4, is it the beginning of section 3?
No, note 4. So the notes are in the back.
No. Yes, I have this.
Where is it? Where does it?
Yes.
Page 4.
Good question. What page does it link to?
It's page 4, and then it's.
I was going to say, I don't think it's in section 3. Thanks.
Yeah, it's like it says that there is creative power embedded with antithesis. It's like the right above.
Yeah, this is. Can I make it bigger? I can't seem to make it bigger.
No, that's why I'm going ahead and just reading it in my own thing.
Yeah. So, it's towards the bottom of the long paragraph, and where he's talking about Hegel and Karl Barth and Rudolf Otto, and really, I mean, you have to understand, it's like, well, Judaism is definitely coming from the Neoplatonic tradition, and so I don't think he's saying anything different than the Neoplatonists ever did, which is the importance of the one, right? But that importance of the one also includes a multiplicity, and this is where I would say the Trinity loses its way. Is there's one, and then there's two that are one, and then there's three that are one, and four that is one, and that's what makes the interrelationship between the one and the many, which is probably the most fundamental question in philosophy, is the one and the many. And so Christianity tries to shoehorn the question of the one and the many into one and three for historical, theological reasons, trying to make the Trinity make sense. But when you truly understand the question of the one and the many, you see, and you referred to it earlier, Elijah, in his book, Lonely Man of Faith, which is usually read after this, he talks about Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, right? Adam Kadmon and Adam Rishon. Adam Kadmon is oftentimes translated as primordial man, right? That is the idea of humanity, which is in Genesis 1, before actual physical creation of Adam Rishon, of the first man, right? So Adam Kadmon, this ideal man, is not actually physical. It's when that ideal man becomes embodied, when God breathes into into this clay, his soul, that we get Adam Rishon, that we get actual physical man, right? And this contrast between Kadmon and Adam Rishon, ideal man and fallen man, in Neoplatonic philosophy reflects this idea of the one and the many, of God and the actuality. And this is what he is starting on. And one of the guys, so Harry, on the Discord, I think he goes by Single Cell, right? So when he first read Halakhic Man, he was like, this is all Trinitarian. It's like, well, in a sense, but it's Judaism being Neoplatonic in ways that I would say Christianity fails to be. Because in Judaism, we talk about the one and the many. We talk about the coming together of two to become one, or three to become one. Hello, Mr. Franco. And 4 and 5 and 6, until we are talking about the one and the infinite, right? And that's when you talk about the one and the infinite, is when you truly see what we would call L'Shem Yichud Kucha Brichu Shchinte, the unification of the Holy One, blessed be He, and His Shekhinah, and His presence. And in a very real sense, what the Rav is doing. So the Lithuanians, it's not like the Lithuanians don't study Kabbalah. They very much do. But it is in the Lithuanian tradition, it's still something that is reserved only for people who have, it's truly esoteric knowledge that is not spoken about openly at all. And in Hasidic philosophy, right, we do, in fact, we believe that these things were revealed openly in certain ways for everyone to consume. And he is taking the Lithuanian strain of saying, I can talk about these things, I can show you the truth of these things through Western philosophy and other philosophy, and show that Torah Umada, right, that God, that revelation and science, that the ideal as opposed to the material, all of these things ultimately go back to one thing. And so, just like any major work of Judaism, ultimately it does go back to monotheism. But our monotheism is not a monism. It's not Muslim monotheism. It's an understanding, it's a panentheistic, Neoplatonic, and I mean, Islam is also Neoplatonic, especially the Sufis and stuff. But yeah, am I just rambling on? I'm sorry.
Well, you're kind of rambling, but it's very interesting. I've always, I mean, you brought in the whole contrast thing again with Judaism and Christianity. I'd noticed also some of the Trinitarian style of description in Halakhic Man. But I've always, on the other side of things from a Christian viewpoint, likened it far more to, like I would say that God's unity from your perspective would be part of that. Like you say, the one and the many being, it's not that God can't be himself without the people and the things he's created, but he's more himself because of it. in my mind. And the same thing where on the Christian side, we should spend a lot more time talking about, if they're going to go there, the body of Christ, which would be a similar concept than simply talking about the Trinity. That thing where God creates and then envelops everything in himself. And we kind of are only able to exist because of that kindness. I'm kind of fascinated by this book, and it definitely has like 90% more language than I understood.
I highly recommend reading this article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, "The Problem of the Many." It's very, very it's something that we get into a lot in this little corner of the internet.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Got it.
I would say, I guess I have two comments to that. One, I kind of agree with what you said, but to me, my basic reading of the first three chapters doesn't seem to reflect that, right? That's why I specifically stated, like, at the beginning of chapter 2, he posits dualism, right? And to me, like, I definitely agree with what you say, because I always think of, like, Isaac Newton holding that prism, right? And you have the white light, and then it comes out into, like, all the colors, right? Like, to me, that makes sense. But to me, like, so the Rav, right, is kind of simplifying it in this statement at the beginning where he says there's only two, right? That's what appeared to me.
Okay, so he is being very, very Jewish in that, and in fact, I believe Aquinas did a similar thing in Summa Theologica, where he is seriously stating the problem in order for people to truly grasp, right? It's this idea of shakalantaria in the Talmud, of going back and forth, of the importance of the intellectual journey, is something that I personally would say, when you look at, for example, a catechism like the Heidelberg Catechism, Protestant catechisms, the questions aren't serious questions. They're expository questions. They're questions that are supposed to elicit a particular answer, so that after you give the answer, you don't need the question anymore. Whereas a Jewish understanding is, you have to have a serious question. This is a question that presumes you already have a strong understanding, and from within that strong understanding, it's asking you a serious question, and the answer doesn't negate the question. The answer, and so that's where the dialectic, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis idea comes. The synthesis is greater than the thesis and the antithesis, and it needs that dialectic in order to get where it's going.
Is this something that's familiar to the rest of you guys in terms of how you might discuss something, or is it kind of sounding more like, like far outside of your expectation for how you talk about stuff?
I don't know. For me, I don't know if I can put it in philosophical terms, but this sounds like, I don't know if you're talking about this, but it sounds like to me like maybe what the Rav is doing, or what you're describing, Jacob, is like, you take these premises and you hold them as true, at least enough. It's not like a binary where it's either true or the most true, or doesn't exist. It's like, we hold these opinions. I was thinking about it that way, but we hold these premises as true enough because we want to build on them, and they're true because they help us build towards the top, and then they become that. So to me, it would be familiar, because if I'm thinking about it in terms of like my job, like trying to solve a problem, I would ask somebody their opinion, and I might think that opinion is the wrong one, but I will use that to build on my opinion and their opinion, then create some kind of synthesis where we want to, solve a problem, get a better solution or something like that. So it will be true enough, and that it will be true for that purpose.
before we go too far, we should have Nathaniel actually introduce himself, say hi, say what he was thinking.
Yeah, well, thanks. I'm in the Discord under Nathaniel. I've called in but once to ask about a misconception I had about the law, this law versus grace idea that's very common that Dr. Michael Brown presented Judaism as. And so listening to Jacob's material helped me kind of like engage with the side of Judaism that I haven't, which is the Orthodox side, which I should be interested as an Orthodox Christian, right? So I'm a philosophy student, and already I read I think whatever pages we decided on in the Discord weeks ago, and engaging now in a metaphysics course where the professor says, well, once you start speculating metaphysically outside of your religion, you've ceased believing in it. That kind of dialectic is the kind of dialectic that I hate and that I find the Rav expressing, at least from where I'm standing, is the way we tend to view things too. Like this faith seeking understanding can be posed in the form of a question, posed in this like interrogative question, like to get to the secret of the matter. Maybe it's not a secret. I don't know. So those are my impressions of like from the conversation and like where I'm standing in relationship to me not being a Jew and reading a little bit of this book as well. So is that helpful?
Yeah. Thank you for your sharing. It's definitely helpful. It's good. So we have a nice broad spectrum of people too in the discussion. Does anyone have anything else to say? I can disagree further, but I think that would be useful.
Well, there's a whole tradition of disagreeing with one another here, isn't there?
Okay, so I can correct Jacob again. I can just say to Jacob, I don't know if you're reading the same text as I'm saying, but ontological dualism, the reflection of onic dualism, states it doesn't state he's positing like, oh, let's just make these things up, like let's just assume them as Ben's saying for sake of argument. He's saying like, no, this is reality, and then he's like going from there. So, like everything you said is nice, but like come on, like let's read the text a little bit. But there we go. That's my strong disagreement. There we go. Let's start a fight. I can be the Chazi to your Jacob for the moment. Right? I know the big shoes to fill, but
Well, it depends. I mean, I've read the entire book. You haven't.
Yeah. Sure, but this pasuk, right? I'll even use a little yeshivish phrase, right? This pasuk says something differently. So, no, but I agree. I think that you can kind of tell where it's going, but. Yeah, so but I think that maybe we can discuss Note 4 a little bit further, because I think the interesting thing about Note 4, particularly at the beginning, he talks about, I guess I'll start. In this concept of dialectic, which he and Karl Barth introduced into the analysis of the unfolding of religious consciousness, and this view concerning antinomic structure of religious experience, which was revised and refined by Rudolf Alto in his book, The Idea of the Holy, gave the lie to the position that is prevalent nowadays in religious circles, whether in Protestant groups or in American Reform and Conservative Judaism, that the religious experience is of very simple nature, that it is devoid of spiritual tortuousness present in the secular cultural consciousness of psychic upheavals and the pains and torments that are inextricably connected to the development and the refinement of man's spiritual personality. I really like this passage. I think it reflects the whole name, like Israel, right? One who struggles with God, perfectly. And I was listening to the chat that PVK had, and Manuel said something in there about like, oh, like part of spiritual stuff. I don't want to like misquote him perfectly, but it seemed like I was hearing what he was saying, that like part of spiritual like stuff is to kind of be like the little balm or salve, right, of the pain of like modernity. But I kind of like this idea, and I think it's more true for like how people like actually experience religion or questions of the spiritual, that it's not like an easy thing. It's not like, oh, I believe in God and it's like I'm really happy now and everything makes sense and life is meaningful and it's super good, right? Like, and I was thinking that that's in some ways like, I know a lot of like new age stuff right, is very much, I feel like, about this. And I guess, some kind of like, prosperity gospel and things like that. And how I think some people then get burned, right, by not having any engagement, right? Just in the questions. And like what Hezi says, right, is always it's a brave space, not a safe space. I kind of thought that was related to that.
What do you mean by it's like that in terms of like the new age? It's like they posit that you need to believe something propositionally. If you do that, that's enough, or that you're at the point where you don't need to make any transformation. Is that what you're saying?
I think that what it's usually like, if there's I don't know what service it is, but I got this service and it was like this ad for the service, and it was something like, all the great books summarized in like 10 minutes, right? And so you can go around and there are a bunch of different like great books, and you just hear this little 10-minute like thing, and like boom, you'll understand it, right? As opposed to you actually reading the great book. It's like a 500-page book, right? Like this book, it has a bunch of like weird Latin terms, and you're like, what are these Latin terms? What do they mean, right? What is he saying? Like, why is he positing dualism when I think something differently? Why does Jacob have a different opinion than me? We have Nathaniel over here, who's an Orthodox Christian. Why is he engaging in Jewish stuff, right? Doesn't he like not want to doubt it? Well, Sandy's over here all the time, right? Ben, you're kind of like a secular guy, right? I'm a clown, right? Like I'm even more confused than anybody here, right? So like, I think that New Age stuff, right, always posits like if you just like believe this and do this, you'll find happiness, right? And I think what the Rav is saying in here is like there's no happiness. Like happiness is not the end goal, right? It's like the whole goal is like the struggle of like understanding and like developing, right? Like you developing as a spiritual person, like that's the process. There is no like end goal of like happiness or bliss. It's not going to be like, man, I was at work, I had this really hard problem to solve, and my coworker had a different idea, I had a different idea, my boss had a different idea, the client had a different idea. And that like I'm going to go to religion, I'm going to say kumbaya, right? Do my little meditation Sam Harris style, and like it's all going to be good.
So the interesting thing is that I don't think this book is pushing us to the conclusion that it's to be a religious person, that it's just all going to be good. When Jacob was talking about the Heidelberg Catechism, I very much see that the description of cognitive man in that, because it talks about wanting to get rid of the mysteries and get everything boxed in so that the answers are what does it say? He goes for clarity and simplicity, like the finite, wanting the finite set answers. Whereas when they're talking about the homo religiosus, the religious being, in that kind of terminology, I could almost picture it being the same, but it's describing that willingness to hold on to the unknowns and to dig deeper into them, which it sounds like in a sense that you would actually enjoy when you're talking about some of your frustration with the straightforward answers that you're not understanding. You're pressing against them with more questions. And that's kind of what he's saying that the homo religiosus would do. The interesting part is where those two things collide, like when Jacob was mentioning about in Genesis, and that I think in essence, Adam was to be the very first Halakhic man, where God takes that which is tangible and which is of the earth and the things that he has created. It's not that they're strictly finite. We debate about that for like peons. We've been, whether there was death prior to the fall and this and that. So it's not necessarily that it's that cut and dried. And there is curiosity, obviously, in the couple Adam and Eve that gets them into trouble. But where the real interesting piece comes is that breath of life that God gives them. That's that little unknown they have to contend with. And I just think that's kind of absolutely fascinating. I want to dig deeper into this because I don't get it. I mean, I do get it. I get enough out of it to know that it intrigues me. And therefore, what is happening with the Halakhic man is that questions beget questions. The more you know, the more you want to know. I think it said somewhere in there. that comes down on the religious man's side. But somehow when you pull those two things together, there's more to the cognitive side and there's more to the religious side, because they increase each other as they bounce off each other. I think that's really fascinating.
Is that the creative force of the dialectic that Rob was talking about earlier in the chapter? For anyone who it was talked about before, because I think sometimes the dialectic can be seen as this destructive thing, or at least where I'm coming from, it's like, well, actually what you get at the end of the process is worse than what you were fighting over. But that's just a pessimistic way of viewing it. But I think in terms of like personal religious discovery, or like going into the scary but I need to be brave for space of like public school, where the first two courses for my environmental ethics course has been, this is why Christianity is bad, and has led to our current crisis, right? Like me actually engaging in listening to that and like, okay, let's entertain this. I do feel this creative, like from that doubt, like what comes back from it is stronger. So they'll assert things that I know don't match up to the way I view things. Maybe they view it in more the scientific or cognitive sense, right? They're just like, the Bible's just written by people and it says, have dominion, right? But me on this other side, like I know I have the evidence that I just read Jacob commenting that pious men will feed pious people feed the leftovers to animals. And I'm like, hey, we should probably do that to our people. So here I am playing in like, that's not my mystery. I don't follow that. I have something similar. And okay, I'm in school for other ends. And what's coming out of that, at least my application of this material, is like, hey, some sort of mastery, some sort of like me coming out of that wouldn't have been there if I didn't have these like other forces kind of nagging at me. So I guess that's like been helpful for me, because I'm going to be engaging with a lot of dialectic Hegelian stuff, and it seems like what we get at the result of that is like their synthesis or their resolution. And I think since I'm not like tied to Halakha, like I don't have a way to appropriate some of the content other than, well, like, how's this manifesting in me, the man, right? Because I don't think I'm going to be a halakhic man, at least not that sense of the term halakhic, right? So.
Well, it reminded me of like opponent processing, right? Like these two forces that are building off each other. And I mean, using the cognitive man is the one. It seemed to be saying something. This is maybe putting it very in simple terms, but like the cognitive man looking for the answers and providing some answers, and that's father. Like that's the MO that the religious man is using to ask more questions. So you really need to, you want to discover something, and I think that's also I think Maimonides also mentions that in terms of this is why you want to learn all these different technological like math and stuff like that, to be able to discover more and more so that you can ask better and better questions, or just ask. And I don't know if I see that you mentioned, Elijah, as like a struggle, that you struggle. I don't know if I would see that as a struggle, or I wouldn't want to see it as a struggle. It's kind of like okay, here's another question and another question and another question. It's like, I guess that's a part of reveling in the mystery, because without the question, well, like I don't know, maybe there's nothing else to do if you don't have a question. So maybe that's why it's nice.
I think that at least from what I get, if he's trying to talk about the struggle, I think the struggle is like, I don't know how everybody starts, but if you kind of delve deep and like really accept like the modern materialist thing, and then you come to some like, resolution, and you're like, okay, so God exists. But now you have this problem because you're so used to being the cognitive man, right? Things don't have meaning, right? Things just are. right? And like there's just science, and there's just like discovery, and there's just material. And then like what do you do when you like come up with like contradictions, let's say perceived contradictions between your holy book and then like science, right? So like when the like earth wasn't the center of the universe, like how did that affect Christianity, right? And how did that affect Judaism? And then when people started to doubt like Mosaic authorship, how does that affect Judaism? How does that affect Christianity? And I think that like that's where like the struggle comes in, where you have these cognitive concepts, right? In like, you know, atheist secular world. And then you have these religious concepts or traditional concepts. And you need to have some sort of harmony between them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just live as a materialist, you then have this sense of existential dread or nihilism. And so you're like, that's not it. But then I have these, you know, let's say, because right, you're an atheist or whatever, you have this plethora of options, right? Which religion is true now, right? That's your thing, because that's all that's what you kind of act. And then if you pick one, then how do you like unify them? And so that's where I think like the struggle is. And then even like interreligiously, there's certain concepts that you have, and you're like, okay, how do I unify all these concepts, right? Two different passages, as Jacob says, that seem to be in contradiction. How do you find the third? And like, yeah, I don't know. I think that's seems to me to be like always the struggle is how do you fit everything meaningfully together, right?
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Correctly, I don't know, Ben.
Have you guys had many opportunities to deal with a situation like in your regular life where that becomes the case? Like, it's like non-theoretically, like actually just stuff where you've had to weigh between things?
I can mention, I don't know if I had to weigh between something, but I think this relates to both your question and what Elijah said in terms of I was starting to pray or I was trying to like do more prayer, which I've never done. Like maybe I've done in the synagogue when I was 13, but I've never really done it on my own. And I didn't start it by also getting myself to think, okay, God exists, and now I believe in this. I was like, okay, let me do some acts, let me do something. And I guess I don't know if this is like I don't know if this will be considered a Jewish thing or not, but like, let me do these things so that I can act in a way and develop that together. Like, and I think what I wanted to mention is that it sounds like when you need to weigh those things together, maybe that's kind of like a definition of faith, of having an axiom, like a foundational axiom that you act from. So even if something seems to derail your thinking or like derail your worldview in any way, you assume, because you have this axiom, that if I still act from within that axiom, from that anchor that is behind everything else, things will reveal themselves even in this new world that I find myself in, even if things are not as I perceive. But I have this axiom, so I believe within it. If I continue acting in that way, it will reveal to me what is true. So, and that's kind of what I try to do, to really be in that axiom, like really have that axiom, and like if I use and then have just that kind of like almost like use that right as like my like salience, like this is how I perceive the world.
So I'm smiling because you are just so Jewish. You're like coming from a very Jewish background, and it's shining through in the way you talk about the various things. So yes, you are incredibly Jewish, Ben.
Well, I was listening to Jewish people, so I guess that's I picked up from them.
Way to go, Ben.
Yeah, there's a similar sense we had as that. So we became Orthodox Christian as a family just within the last like 2 years. And part of the different understanding in prayer, rather than being like we still have like moments of supplication, but the formal style of prayer was to really kind of kick my body into shape. Like part of my mind wants to pray. I was like, oh, I don't know what to pray. So like, let's habituate the body. Let's like get those words in my gut to come out of me, and like, hey, maybe I do that enough, and like it will become part of me, and it's carried us since. So I really resonated with that, and I think I'm glad you said like it gives you this like this pistis, like faith, like the trust in like an axiomatic position to like at least stand from. Because when the professor said that, I'm like, hold on, like like I surely I could test the ground I'm standing out without denying there's a ground that I'm standing on. Like like I can make sure it's like has foundation under it if it's hardwood, right? Like there's things I can do, and maybe if I whack that ground and there's something underneath it, I'll be terrified and convert. Like, but like I'm still acting from like, maybe the analogy is breaking down, but I'm still acting from like a position. So it just seems like a false lemma to get in, to say, well, if I'm poking my nose over here and like listening to Orthodox Jewish conversations and inner dialogue, then like I've ceased being a Christian. Or
Well, it depends if you have. I mean, there is a certain, and this is, I mean, in the United States, we are steeped in Protestantism in ways that we often don't understand. And I'm guessing your professor, I mean, what he's saying, it sounds like a very Protestant way of understanding
he's
being a Christian.
He was taught by Jesuits in Germany as a metaphysician. So he's coming from like a really like continental philosophical perspective. I guess he has a degree in theology, but hearing that is I don't know, maybe that's to weed out all the wimps out of the first class. Like, because you can't do metaphysics or like, because you're questioning being, you can't like do that if it's all religious man like that. If it's just the mystery of like, well, what comes to me, or if there's no interrogating reality, then okay, then you can leave the class. You could be a religious man, at least the way it seemed presented in the course.
I don't know I'd used the word interrogate. Did anybody else take it that way? Because I didn't.
Asking questions, I guess. Like when I talk to other students today, in the same way I think I interact with other things I do, I kind of have to like, at least the way I'm thinking about it is like, well, what's going on here? Who am I actually talking to? And I have to actually do that. Because if I think like they're as they appear to me, and I know them enough, but I actually don't know them, I actually have to talk to them and like get those things out of them. If they'll share with me,
I think maybe, like why this resonated with me, this like note 4, is that I think for me, I kind of was raised potentially in a like system, but then because I had so many like influences on me, it caused like a lot of confusion and doubt. And so while maybe I'm like Ben or Nathaniel or whatever, and I can, potentially say, okay, I can just, have my little precious axiom, and I can guard it and protect it, and I can use it as the light, to discover things. If you don't have that, right? If you come from a position of you don't have any axioms, right? Or you do have axioms, then you're like, oh, okay, this one was wrong, and now I'm left without an axiom, right? Like got proven incorrect. You're like, okay, so like, what do you do then, right? And like, this is where it's a struggle. And I think it's also, once you come from that position, right, like your ability to like put total faith in any axiom or anything is really destroyed, because it's, it's kind of like, I don't know, I was raised to believe in like, Santa and the Easter Bunny, right? And so when you're taught, okay, Santa isn't real, the Easter Bunny isn't real, you're like, okay, God isn't real, right? Like, right? It's like boom, 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 right? Things you were told. And so like, I think that in some ways, like that causes like a scar, right? Where you're like, okay, now I'm going to start to doubt everything, right? And so, like, I suffer from a lot of like skepticism, and like because of that, then I can't hold my little axiom, because like the voice in my head is now always saying question that axiom, question that axiom, question that axiom, and it's like incessant. It never goes away. So then you're like, okay, well, how do I then, like, I can't have any foundation, right? Because I'm always in the process of undermining myself, right? And so I think that this is why that note was so like true for me, right? Because when I'm trying to do these things, like it's a huge struggle, because I'm always like doubting myself and doubting what I'm being told and doubting my axiom, right? So I think that that's like kind of why that note really resonated with me, because it's like I don't have access to that.
Interesting. So, did you say something about having to prove to yourself?
Maybe I did, but it's always like more like there's constant doubt, right? Like
Yeah.
I always like question it, and so instead of like proving, it's like it's like the negative, like doubting.
I kind of love the word prove. I'm one of those horribly obnoxious people that really likes words. So I hang out on etymology.com way more than is probably really useful. And like even like years back, we tend to say prove like we mean like they would say in Star Trek, you go up to the thing and you go, I want this, or you say to your person that's under you, make it so when it happens. That's not the only way that the word prove exists. Prove has an interesting history and an interesting journey, and it also means that kind of like sense of delving into something, so that it isn't the outcome, but it's the journey. It's that sense of, like the blind man in the elephant. You just kind of, you go and you delve into something, you put your hands on it. They used to have a saying, the proof's in the pudding, and I used to make bread, and you think about it's the interaction of things without the kneading, without the action. You're not going to get that version of proof that you were speaking to anyways, because nothing has happened. So I kind of love that word, sorry, but I just find it interesting.
Yeah, Elijah, is the fact that you have the question makes it offensive to the axiom? Like, you know what I mean? Like, in terms of, like, I anticipate. So maybe I'm coming from a position that I anticipate the question. So again, the questions, they're not making me doubt the axiom in a bad way. They're a way to strengthen the axiom, or maybe develop the axiom, right? Because you don't know if it's going to strengthen it or weaken it, right? You're in a position where you, so yeah. I'm trying to kind of find the difference between, because I don't know. Again, it's not like I'm coming from a very like strong place where I was like, okay, I'm gonna like like hold that axiom, and it's gonna be like it's not a total thing at all. So I'm trying to figure out the differences, or like the nuance.
I would almost say it's like somehow related to like comfortability, right? Where like I guess the reason why I like the note is because it's in some ways like painful, and even though, right, like I expect questions to come up, right? Like I don't not expect them, but the process in and of itself is unpleasant, right? Like
Right.
It's more pleasant to hold something, to know it's true, and like to have to not worry about it, right? But if you always anticipate the question, right, like it starts to become like burdensome, I think, in some ways.
To hold the question is
That- yeah, so like I think like you have a question, like if you have something that's concrete, like once you have this like bit of concrete understanding, then you can use that to like help you. But if you, how should I say this? Like, what's a good analogy? I don't know if I have to think of one, but I think for me it's kind of like let's say you wake up in like a dark cave, right? And and you find like, let's say like a magic candle, for example, I don't know, like a flashlight or whatever. And so you're like, okay, cool, I can now navigate this dark cave with this flashlight. But what happens when you start to doubt that the flashlight is really a flashlight? And that instead of like illuminating the cave, it's like a projector, right? So it's like projecting things like in an empty space, like a hologram or something like that. And so you're like, oh, this is a bad flashlight. And so like you just happen to find on the cave another flashlight. And you pick up that flashlight and it illuminates a different thing in the cave, right? And so you're now like, well, I have this flashlight and I have this flashlight. Which flashlight is real? And now I'm like, am I seeing something that's real? Like, is what I'm seeing really there or not? Right? And this is the problem where it's like, now I'm even doubting like the existence of the flashlight. Like, okay, like where am I? Like, why am I in this place where I can flash one thing and it's one perspective, and the other thing, it's another perspective? And yeah, I don't know. Like, this is, I guess, my problem, where it's like once you start doubting that kind of thing, it's hard to like have any certainty, and like I feel like you need some level of certainty to like move on. I don't know.
Possibly. I'm reading further down the list and see, or the note, and seeing it eventually gets to Psalm 23, which is kind of one of the ones I've been since Jacob talked to me about Protestant prayers versus liturgy, and reminding me of my past in the Anglican tradition where we said a lot of liturgy. I love Psalm 23. It's one of those places like this where there's a mystery, because it sounds like it's saying two opposing things at once, depending on how you read it, and you want to read it properly. I remember when we were little, we'd ask our parents, why does it say, I don't want God? They'd go, well, it doesn't say that, because people would say it quickly. The Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. We're going, but why wouldn't you want? There again, it goes back to words and word usage and stuff, because it's not saying I don't want something. It is saying I'm not going to experience want, that place of emptiness. I am not going to be without his presence, and I love that reassurance in there, because, like David was saying, that from a place where he was right in the depths of need. And I kind of have a question to your this place of doubt and needing to have a set answer. I for years based a lot of my life and my own faith around the things I was given to deal with. And Jacob and I have talked before about how much he hates hospitals and how much time we spent in hospitals when my son was a baby, and the first decade maybe of his life. Our first surgery with him was in 1987. My cousin was a lab tech, and it was an 11-hour surgery, and they were going to need to give him blood, and she was freaking out because it was the years of the tainted blood thing. And she's going to me, you cannot let them give him blood. So here I'm sitting with a child who needs surgery. He had a skull problem where the bones joined too soon, so they've got to reopen them. And I remember saying, because my family would ask, so you're sitting there. It's not whether the answer is right or wrong. It's just that the answer lives in between tough choices or two different extremes. On the one hand, I have a child who by 4 months old has no soft spot and no room for the brain to grow because the skull is growing at a much slower pace than the soft tissue of his brain. And on the other side, I've gone in and we've talked over the procedure and what's going to be done. And I have a cousin who's freaking out that he's going to have several bags of blood. And she doesn't want me to let them in case he catches something from the blood. And so when I would talk to friends later about faith, I'd say, it's sometimes when you start out life with a question of, so I don't give my child surgery and I definitely give him brain damage, or I do give my child surgery and I can potentially kill him. After that, most of life's questions aren't that hard anymore because, they are. Yeah, I know, Jacob. They are. They're still hard. But it kind of gave me some perspective that there's not just, it's not like the catechism. It's not like here's your question and answer 1, 2, 3 to 10 or however many, and here's the answer you're going to say. So on the one hand, I totally agree with Jacob that life needs more than Protestant prayers that just kind of ramble on, like my initial notes on this book we're reading. It also can't only live in the spots where I'm giving single word points down my list saying you got to simplify this thing way further. It has to somehow live in the tension. And I kind of, when you were talking, Elijah, about with the part you read to us from note 4 at the beginning, I can feel that tension. You also seemed really intrigued by it. So maybe there's a part of you that wants the straightforward Q&A answers, but there's a part that I hear also that really wants what you're going to get from the tension. You can feel that that's an important place. And I've lived that, and I would agree. That's really important in our life, to have those places where we feel the tension and we walk through them. And we don't do that alone. I really believe we do that with God. So.
I was about to say we don't do it alone, and we also do it with other people. So in that cave, one of the things that can help you move around or figure out what's true or not is other people that can tell you what they see. If you're walking into a wall, into a mouth of a bear or anything else, so that could be one of the tests of, is this flashlight showing me something that's real? First of all, is it bringing me somewhere that's good for me, whatever that means? We can delve into that. But how is it with other people? What do other people that I trust think? So.
I guess that's why we're all here, right?
There's this section in the book on page 10 that I remember. It was talking about Job, and near on the left side, on page 10, middle of the page, near the end of that paragraph, it says, "Strange polarity of disclosure and hiding, revealing and concealing breaks forth and seizes hold of the consciousness of the man of God. He discloses in order to hide, reveals in order to conceal." And there's this book written by an archimandrite called "Remember Thy First Love." And it has a similar theme where, like, God establishes Moses. Moses is the model here, right? Good model. He is established, and then there's this moment of wandering to allow that kind of struggle to go on, because there's blessing in that. And although he doesn't see the promised land, there's of course his ascension, and that kind of, like, that whole journey has seen that reestablishment of that first love and the fulfillment of that. God's like, okay, here's my initial grace. Like, let's walk away a bit. Let's let you walk and stumble a few times. well, now my child's running, right? And now he's like jumping and he's doing all the great things because I let him go off the rails and walk. So I think that relationship that the man of God has to God is very much like the ideal relationship we should have with others, right? I can't systematize my relationship with my wife as much as I'd like to in my mind. once the system goes awry and this face starts to look angry because I'm thinking really hard, like I'm off in mystery land. I don't know, like what, like I need to reassess how I see the circumstance. So I find his explication of what he's getting at from the biblical text to be really helpful here, and it touches on things I read. I mean, that book, if I read one or two lines from this monk, I'm like, I need to put the book down. That's enough for me to read, because it's like, I don't want to treat this as common. And kind of when I got to that, I was like, yeah, that's it. Like God does like reveal to conceal, so we can strive after him. And that question can nag us though, or that sense of like, well, he's concealed himself. Like, is he gone for good? That's the fear we can slip into, and I go through that quite a bit. But I feel like on the other side, I'm like, well, I know I no longer have that doubt, at least now, right? So I can sympathize with that a lot, Elijah. And I think now's the proving ground for me, right? Like, go to college, take all this popularized stuff I've learned and like test it, prove it, like check it. Is it really cooked all the way, or did you make a soggy cake, right? That kind of proving. Like, no, I need to actually know like the content and trust that from where I'm standing, like it won't completely disintegrate, because I have that faith in God. I just am not privy to the entirety of it all, you know. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that this also kind of correlates or coalesces, right, in that the third chapter or whatever, at the end where he talks about negative theology, right? And how by kind of like, right, doubting, denying, destroying, right, that kind of then gives you the affirmative, right? So you're like, okay, that's not a problem. I doubted that. I figured, I looked at it. It's not a problem. It goes away, right? And then like when you do that, then you can kind of come to the affirmation. So even though it's like maybe not super pleasant, like it still kind of ends up in an interesting or good place.
So, this reminded me, so to reveal in order to conceal, and also what you just mentioned in terms of the negative theology. What came to mind for me, and this might be tangential, was the story of Moses, and also just because I also listened to Vervaekian, Jordan Peterson, of revealing in order to concealing, or doing this move where, so you can see it in Moses and in the burning bush, of like revealing something, and then Moses has to go there, and then part of the process is to negate, right? The shoes, maybe the shoes is negating the holding his face, right? So that you can't see God is negating. So, but it's display of first revealing or noticing something and seeing it and categorizing. And I think Jordan Peterson also makes a note of that, of like, you have to categorize first, because you can't just negate everything, because then, he mentions like that's like, you can't live like that. You can't just live without categorization. So it has to be some categorization at the cognitive level, at least. And then you negate from there, maybe from a place of humility. And this is depends, and this works if we're talking about Moses, right? That's kind of like, that kind of like made it a little bit more interesting to me. But that's kind of what I thought about when I read that.
Mm-hmm.
What do we think about this? I read it kind of reflexively, because Tertullian's mentioned, but he said, I believe because it is absurd. Like, do we find ourselves in, like, what do we think about that? Because I think I share a sentiment after like my reaction to going, hey, well, that doesn't really make any sense to me. Like this seems like a silly thing to say. I mean, but and I'm still reading it again, so it follows shortly after this.
Was that in section 3, or where did you?
Yeah, it's on page 10 at the bottom.
At the bottom. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is this like just like a mysticism where you say, well, I don't really know what that was, but I believe in that because that was crazy. Like,
Well, I don't know if he's referring because this made me think about like Sartre and Camus. I don't know if I'm pronouncing their names right, but like absurdism of, and I was trying to look at that because I don't remember the definition or how but they spoke about that is like that life is absurd, but the only way to live life is to accept that reality, and then you accept that reality, you can live your life like that. But that was kind of like, and they used it more also from I just know them from a more literary perspective. Sorry, because get more in everything, but I don't know if that's kind of like what he was referring to.
Yeah, I have some familiarity with like absurdism from school, and I feel like you're touching on something because it is kind of like a slight distinction, and it can trick us into thinking we're saying the same thing. Like so you have the cognitive man seeking to define everything, and then that would be maybe analogous to the person who's convinced that life is just like full of meaning, and like I could point to all the meaning, I have it all. And the absurd ones, like it's all a big mystery, I don't know why I'm here. It's a mess, or this kind of like I believe because it is absurd position. It's like, well, there's still a mystery there, but like is it like the way that we respond to the mystery, I suppose? Because a sense that I'm getting is that it's not good to kind of be agnostic or to systematize too heavily on either side. Really, like both are good tools, as Jacob said before. Like we're all kind of legalistic in a sense. Like we all have a sense where things should be ordered, but like that's not the whole of it. And it doesn't mean we fall into the other side to say, well, like since no one can agree on how to systematize, like you know, I don't know. Maybe I'm not getting the point from the text, but it just, that quote stuck out to me because it follows immediately after this revealing and concealing part of God. So like we actually do have something to hold on to if he's revealed, right?
Yeah, I think that what the Rav is saying is that this is a bad position, right? Because he says, a position born out of the bitter despair and terrible disillusionment of a man who, with his intellect, knocks upon the gates of the universe that stands shut and locked before him, right? So he's saying, like, the absurdist position is like the position of despair, which you don't want. And like, by doing what the religious guy says, or acting like the religious man, you can have hope. So,
right, because the absurd person maybe accepts the mystery, but accepts it without. We will accept any kind of mystery, and he would not. There is no direction to the mystery, right? For the absurd is like, I accept it because it's absurd, because I believe life is absurd. So whatever comes to me, right? It's like it's kind of like a buffet kind of thing. He's like more of the buffet person as opposed to I don't know what the other people, how they eat their meals, but yeah.
So as this continues, it's going to get a little bit more dense in terms of the Jewish concepts, Jacob. Okay.
I mean,
You mentioned
it's already dense. I mean, I just noticed like it talks about Teku, and I'm sure like maybe Ben's heard of Teku, but not really. As it goes on, I mean, this is part of a spiritual biography where he was actually like also talking about how he grew up and his relationship with his father and his uncle, and and honestly, like, when note 4, which I talk about a lot, it's hard to even translate what he's talking about. For example, when he talks about the Psalm, is it 23, Mizmor LaDavid? He, like, so, I mean, for most Jews, the idea of, okay, the third meal on the afternoon of the Sabbath as the sun is going down, right? And the Sabbath is leaving, and, the way Mizmor LaDavid is plaintively sung as we say goodbye, right? I think that's comprehensible, whereas, I mean, I can't even imagine how a Christian imagines that. It's just so different. Like, this is part of what I was talking to Father Stephen about. Like, he talks about Orthodox Christianity being the full meal, and Protestantism being like a turkey sandwich, right, as opposed to a Thanksgiving meal, right? And it's like, well, to me it seems like, especially when I talk to Father Stephen about the Orthodox Christian understanding of Jewish rituals, it's like turkey sandwich at best, maybe a corn dog on a stick, it's no Thanksgiving meal. And I don't know.
Let him answer to those objections. He's my scholar here.
He's an archpriest, but, like, I don't know, Ben, like, how much you've experienced of that. I mean, you did grow up in a traditional Israeli home, like, the Sabbath leaving, like, even I think in a completely unreligious Israeli home, like, the sun sets and something, it's different. Like, you're aware of when the Sabbath ends, at least in Jerusalem, certainly, because, like, that's when everything, the hustle and bustle, and, like, it, and yeah, I honestly, like, I'm more than happy that people who are not Jewish are interested in Halakhic man, but even for secular Jews and American Jews, it's incredibly hard to connect to what he's talking about, and I'm mostly here to, like, see what you guys, like, ask about, and, like, try to understand how somebody who isn't from an Orthodox perspective, like, I was expecting a bunch of questions, like, about Teku and 613. I was expecting to be here just, like, translating.
I did see
concepts.
that word. You can if you want to.
We might get there.
So,
I mean, we might get there.
Well, Teku, okay, so in the Talmud, certain, like, so the Talmud is a question of debates, right? And there are debates, and many of them do have some sort of resolution, but some of them, the rabbis themselves in the Talmud say of them teku. Like, we don't know. This is something. Teku is kind of like, that's not what it means, but Tishbi Yavo, that Elijah will come and answer it when the Messiah comes, right? And so when he's talking about, however, knowledge does not forfeit its objective status and intrinsic significance as a result of the teku, the unresolvable problem that peers out of its windows. On the contrary, the riddle adorns and embellishes cognition, bestowing upon it the splendor of eternity, right? That even if if we have to leave something unresolved, like we still believe in that in that engagement of knowledge, of dot, right? That intimate knowledge. Like, you have to understand, v'yadata hayom v'hashavota el levavecha, right? Shahavaya hu ha'elokim. It's a verse in Deuteronomy, I believe. You shall know and settle in your heart that that the Lord is God, like that the Tetragrammaton is God, right? And so, like, to say that you have to know Hashem, right? You have to know God with da'at, with an intimate knowledge, like, that's an incredible thing to say. Like, it's a mystical and wondrous thing within Judaism to say that we are commanded to know God in something that is somehow analogous to Adam knowing Eve. That's like almost blasphemous and heretical, yet it's right there in the Bible.
But it can't be blasphemous or heretical because God said it.
Took me a while actually to figure out what word you were talking about because I always need, like, I don't, the tekel. I've never I've never heard about that before, and like Jacob and my Hebrew are different in terms of like
right.
the accent.
Teku is the yeshivish way of saying it. Yes.
Right. So teko, I don't know if this would be useful, but in modern Hebrew we use it to say, like in sport, we would say you either win or it's teko, a teko. Like it's a draw. So I guess that's what they say in the Talmud. It's a draw, or this is how we use it in modern Hebrew. So it's very interesting. I didn't know about the etymology of that.
Yeah. Sorry, looking it up. Can't help it. It's a word. I love it.
Would you say, Jacob, because this might help me make sure I'm tracking, that is there like there's something you can't replace because you're not actually participating in it, but would you say it gives you I don't want to undersell it. It's like it gives a lot more meaning to time, just time in general, because you're entering into something really, like, as you said, like, that allows you to participate in the divine, to develop that intimacy. So it's like, well, this is the time, like, am I
right? I think so. One of the problems that I have as I rail against Protestantism is this devaluing of the profane, right? So when Chezi talks about the Sabbath, he says, Shabbat is an island I swim to every week, right? And, like, part of that understanding is an understanding that, like, it's not like he's swimming back to it. He's swimming from island to island, right? And this idea of madrigot, of ascending Jacob's ladder, right? Of, like, actually a spiritual ascent, right? That is repetitive. And so the cycle of the week, and then the months, and then the years, right? After monotheism, the greatest difference and innovation of Abrahamic religion over basically all other religions is this idea that the world had a beginning and has an end, and that God has a plan where we're going from the beginning to the end, right? So the term Big Bang, right? When it was first used, it was a derogatory term because, like, until the 30s at least, like 1930s, less than 100 years ago, basically all natural scientists thought this Jewish idea of creation, a beginning of the world, was nonsense. It was like, no, who said that the world had to have a beginning? The world's always been, right? It was called the steady state hypothesis, right? And it was basically everybody believed it. And when Catholic cosmologists finally proved that the Big Bang, right, that in fact the world had a beginning, right? This was a huge coup for the religious in science. And then somehow that got twisted, and now people think the Big Bang is somehow a refutation of Genesis. And it's like, you've got it absolutely backwards from what it was even 100 years ago, right? And so this idea of progression and the profane, like, I mean, okay, I'm gonna go on a rant. Like, there is a Christian idea of the God of this world as opposed to the one God, which is clearly idolatrous and polytheistic. Like, everything is created by God. Satan was created by God. Everything. It says in Isaiah, I created good and I created evil. I am the Lord who created these things. I created light and I created darkness, right? And it's very emphatic that, and you know, in Judaism we say, Keshem shemevarchem al hatov, mevarchem al hara. In the same manner as we thank God for the good things in our lives, we thank him for the bad things in our lives. And that's a really difficult thing for a religious community coming out of the Holocaust to say. And like, I have no questions on the people who are like, I can't accept that, right? That there's a famous Jewish joke that this guy dies and he goes to heaven and he's talking to God and he tells God a Holocaust joke and God doesn't get it. And he says, I guess you had to be there. Right?
Is it thanking God for that, or is it at least saying
Mevarchim.
Baruch Dayan Emet, right? Like
right.
It's
well,
at least accepting it's true.
Blessed, but when we bless God, right? It is an acceptance, but it's actually even so. This is something that Hasidic philosophy goes into. You're supposed to say every bracha with joy. You are supposed to celebrate, right? Every blessing you say of God, right? And the question becomes, how do you say Baruch Dayan Emet? Which is the blessing you say when you hear, and you say the complete blessing when one of your parents dies, or one of your children, one of your 7 close relatives, your mother, father, son, daughter, spouse, and grandparents and grandchildren. I think that's the 7. I might be getting it wrong, but the 7 close relatives, right? You say the full blessing, Baruch Dayan Emet, blessed is the true judge, right? And you're supposed to say that with simcha, with joy in your heart, right? And like, this is one of like the struggles within Judaism. Like, how are we expected to do that? But we are. And so saying a bracha, yeah, it is. I mean, I translated it not as blessing, I translated it as joy, because because the reason we say brachot, right, is because we are thanking God for whatever it is. And you make brachot on all kinds of things that, like, bad, all kinds of bad things, right? Because it's all from the same God. And that's really, really difficult.
Yeah, thanks. That helped kind of re-situate me on that. Just even just drawing that image of like from Shabbat to Shabbat as forward is just clarified a lot about what you said. It is kind of like duh, because we kind of do the same thing. I mean, we get it from somewhere, right? But every Sunday, like there was a archimandrite, so leader of monastery, by, and he's like, we constantly hear stories that like he's crawling out of bed like Sunday morning, like dying, like hey, this is the way he feels. But then by the time he's done with that liturgy, it's like, all right, like I've been reinvigorated, like there's a new life. And then Saturday comes and he's like, all right, life's exiting me. Like, I hope I can make it to Sunday. So I think that kind of striving forward and with all the gook in between, having that recapitulated back into the next week is just, I don't know how else I would say sane. So I don't blame this. Like, no, I'm not going to give this up. Like, what are you telling me to give up? You're telling me to give up everything. Yeah, I get the disconnect there. So I'll let Father Stephen DeYoung handle the nuance on that.
But is it appreciating when you said Jacob and Nathaniel, like in terms of appreciating the profane, or is that the same as like our conversation about cognitive man and the necessity of those two modes, where you're not only it's not only the Sabbath, it's not only the weekdays, it's both. It's, you need both of them to appreciate each other, or you need both of them to have some kind of dynamic. Kind of reminded me of that. I don't know if it makes sense for anybody else.
We hymn in our liturgy, Psalm 103, the Lord heals all of our iniquities. And I'm not going to quote it. I could sing it from the start because I'm in the choir, but I can't quote verbatim. But like, well, yeah, I need to have a whole week of like ups and downs, like, because it's not like predestined, but like, like I can't say from within me, bless the Lord, like, like
Mm-hmm.
if it's just all, I don't know. I have to, when I say it, it's like the whole week was before me. So really I am doing that. And if I'm more cognizant of it, I could trek forward a different way. But as weak as I am, it's like the moment, the doubt of the profane habits, like, well, I just want to go back to church and like heal this. Like, I want that religious salve, that's the temptation, is the easy way out.
So when you were talking about the Jewish joke coming out from, about talking to God about the Holocaust, and you had to be there. And then you're talking to us about the profane, and I did look it up again, just kind of to refresh my memory that, like, yeah, being out that which is outside the temple. But if God made everything, nothing's outside of God. So even the profane, in a sense, is holy. But you have to appreciate the profane for what it is. Is that sort of the place that joke comes from? Where you can simply...
So, I mean, ultimately, the blessing that we say, which formally ends the Sabbath, is in... So, there's the Amidah, the 18 blessings that constitutes Jewish prayer, right? And after the first 3, which are standard, the first one you say on the weekday is Chonen Da'at. It is, you thank God for Da'at, for knowledge. And within it, that's where you make Havdalah. That's where you make the difference. And you say, thank you, God, for giving us knowledge, for knowing the difference between Kadosh v'chol, holy and profane, the 6 days of the week and the 7th, Jews and Gentiles. And it's like, okay, this is a real separation, but at the same time, it's a separation which creates the whole. If you don't have an inner courtyard, it was funny. Like I was listening to Orthodox Shahada trying to explain the similarities between Orthodox Christianity and Judaism as opposed to Islam. And one of the things that they were talking about is we have a narthex, right? We have the places where only the priests can go, right? We have the places where only, there is a courtyard, which is kind of funny considering how a lot of Protestants understand Christianity as completely obliterating the difference between Jew and Gentile. Whereas, in Judaism, we don't have... Well, nobody who actually understands Judaism wishes for the Gentiles to disappear, because the role of Israel as a nation of priests is dependent on the people. The idea of having Zion, right, the Temple Mount, is dependent on the rest of the world existing, right? Mm-hmm. Imagine if the city of God were just Jerusalem and the rest of the world disappears. That's a denial of creation. Elijah, you're being really quiet.
Yeah, I'm just absorbing it. You made me cut off my bells. I used to have bells on the hat, right? So I have to be quiet now. So
I almost want to go. Can you repeat what you said when you started talking, Jacob? You were it really grabbed my attention because you were talking about the prayers in the first 3 prayer, or the first prayer of the day, thanking God for knowledge. And then you were sharing a bit about that, and my mind immediately jumps back to Genesis and kind of that whole... I don't know if it's just the I've read Genesis. My ex loves Genesis. But it always seems to come back to, it seems to come back to a piece of fruit and, that which we should not know. But that's not what you just said, because we have to also thank God for knowledge. even though knowledge, in a sense, from the Christian side, in any ways that I grew up with, has been like preached against and against and against, because, especially for me as a woman, my ex would say, oh, well, but it's Eve who took the apple. And I'm like, well, there's a
Well,
point,
first of all, that
there's a
doesn't
point
go
for
along
missing,
with
but
the Jewish understanding anyway. It was the Jewish understanding. It was Adam's fault, not Eve's. So
yeah,
like,
I wasn't saying it for that purpose anyways. It was more that sense of, okay, you sit and you read it and you listen to all the typical things said about it, and then I hear you say, and you thank God for knowledge.
yeah.
It's, yeah, I mean, we get into so much trouble struggling with knowledge and what we do and don't know, and we thank God for that. That's kind of beautiful.
Well, how much Hebrew am I going to need to know for this next section?
So the translations, I mean, he definitely tried to translate everything. I mean, and I think the only things that he didn't translate, like, he tries to explain them. The difficulty becomes, like, when you look at note 4, right? That's the one that I've tried explaining to a lot of people. Like, for example, there's the part where he's cynically and very clearly sarcastically interpreting Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladecha mibeit avicha. Go out from your home, from your land, your place of your birth, from the house of your father, right? And like, it's dripping, oozing with sarcasm in a Jewish way that I'm not sure when you read it, it's really clear to you. There in note 4, right? He's absolutely being completely dismissive of that, because like when we talk about Lech Lecha, right? When that, it's like one of the most talked about. It's in Genesis. It's like, and that verse is the beginning of the parsha. So like, it's very well talked about, right? This idea of going out of yourself, of tortuousness, of, he's and like the sarcasm. I'm not sure you would see it. And so further on, when he's talking about his relationship with his father and stuff, like, the second time I read it last year or so, I was trying to read it in terms of, okay, is this something I can recommend to Gentiles as like, okay, here's a Jewish book, you can, and it was like, as I was reading through it, I was like, yeah, this isn't, and when Elijah said he wanted to do it for the book club, I was like, okay, I mean, that's beautiful, and I'm like, I will be as supportive as I can. I just, I was wondering, like, what this is going to be like.
You just came to be entertained, didn't you?
And I was.
Well, there's someone to thank for all the entertainment, I suppose.
Well, I mean, if people continue, I mean, and next time, I don't know, Elijah, were you planning, how often were you planning on having this?
I don't know. I guess it depends on how many pages or chapters people want to go through. I mean, Yosef kind of said, like, try and keep it small. I was thinking maybe the next section we could read until page 29. That's a little bit longer than this one, but it looked like the notes were a bit smaller. Like, we didn't have that big note 4. And I don't know, do people want to do every week, every other week? What's better for everyone's schedule?
I think every other makes sense because I had a lot of time to like read it and then reflect on it and then listen to. We're all listening to stuff a bit, I presume, right? So it's like, all right, like, and it allows us to live a bit and then come back and go like, hey, did I remember anything? And it allows us, it sounds good, at least to me.
And especially on the Discord, I mean, if anybody, like, you have a question about, words or whatever, just ask. Like, this is certainly for Chezi and for Yosef, like, this is considered a foundational text for their wing of Orthodox Judaism. And even like, I come from the more Hasidic, like, side. Like, the Rav, there's a reason why you can just call him the Rav. Like, he's the rabbi,
Interesting.
Every other week
Well, I'm
works
sure.
for me as well. Oh, yeah, we'll go for that. Sorry.
Yeah. No, we're determining times. I'm tempted to speculate that Hezi will probably have some good things and interesting things to say about this if it continues to. So that's kind of what I'm here for too. I'm actually interested in pursuing like a scholarship for Jewish studies a bit because my professor was big into that. He did a whole study on Jewish ghost stories as part of his views of the afterlife and thesis. So I'm kind of like, all right, like, hey, I could tag along with this, whether I'm here every time. But I think that schedule gives people time to chew on it and absorb it.
Yep, sounds good. So I put in the Discord, we can read pages 13 to 29, and we'll meet on the 2nd of February.
Great.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Great conversation. Thank you, Jacob, for explaining things and ranting. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Okay, so I'll end the broadcast.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.